Okay, thank you all for being here. We're going to get started now. Um, Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Salazar de Bro. I'm an Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Specialist with the City of Olympia's Parks, Arts, and Recreation Department. And it is my honor to welcome and thank you for joining us for today's lecture on the Maroon peoples of the Southern United States with Dr. Sylviane Diouf. This event has been made possible through a partnership between the Hawk Foundation for Research and Education in African Culture, the City of Olympia, and the Olympia School District. So as we settle in, we do have a few announcements. So to start, the City of Olympia honors and acknowledges the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial and who still inhabit the area today, the Stechas Band of Indigenous people of the Squaxin Island tribe. And this is our second year that we've partnered with the Hawk Foundation to commemorate and celebrate Black History Month. And this year we have expanded to host an event series. There are 2 more Black History Month events to be held tomorrow, February 17th, and on Saturday, the 18th. Information can be found on our website at olympiawa.gov/calendar. So closed captioning has been enabled, and you can choose to hide them in your settings. If you have any technical issues, you can chat to the host directly so that we can troubleshoot the issue. And after the main presentation by Dr. Diouf, there will be a question and answer period. So please use the Q&A box for any questions that come up so that Dr. Diouf can answer them at the end of her presentation. In addition, during the Q&A, you can use the raise hand feature, and we can unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question. And we will do our best to get to all of the questions during our time together, but if we can't, we will forward any remaining questions to Dr. Diouf afterwards. Lastly, this lecture is being recorded and it will be posted on the city's YouTube channel. And now I would like to invite the City of Olympia's Mayor Pro Tem Gilman to please share some remarks.
Good afternoon. I'm Clark Gilman, Mayor Pro Tem of the City of Olympia, and I'm so glad you've all been able to join us today and help us kick off 3 amazing events planned in honor of Black History Month. The city has had the good fortune to partner with the Hawk Foundation and the Olympia School District to make these events happen. Black History Month is a time to reflect on the past and to look forward to the future, to acknowledge and bear witness to our shared history and to honor the contributions and achievements of African Americans in Olympia and throughout the country. We would like to thank Dr. Sylviane Diouf for being here today to tell the stories of the Maroon people who escaped enslavement and formed their own communities, stories that she's uncovered through decades of research. Today's program is an opportunity to learn more about our shared history and consider the work that we still need to do to dismantle the racism and oppression that continue to exist today. Make no mistake, we know that racism continues to exist even here in our own Olympia community, a community which we are generally so very proud of, but we know we have more work to do. On February 7th, 2023, my City Council colleagues and I recognized Black History Month by proclamation. That proclamation declares that we embrace cultural diversity and we encourage all Olympians to honor and respect the African American experience. It proclaims that we commit to work towards a nation where all people have equal opportunity to thrive. And your presence today is part of that effort. Thank you all so much for being here, particularly to any young people who are able to join us. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of our community's guides on this journey, our city partner and tonight's facilitator. Please join me in welcoming Javon Bird, the founder and director of the Hawk Foundation for Research and Education in African Culture.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mayor, Pro Tem Mayor Gilman. Thank you, Olivia. Greetings, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Education is truly one of the most powerful tools known to humanity. You can inspire whole nations to create a better world for all, or you can also incite self-destruction with the lack of knowledge. While I personally believe that students should be educated on facts and then choose for themselves their views and opinions of the world, the education institution should in fact strive for intellectual discourse and not for intellectual indoctrination. I would like to read a quote, an interesting quote, from actually the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. It goes, he said, "It was the American Revolution that caused people to question slavery. No one had questioned it before, and we decided as Americans that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, and that we are all created equal. Then that birthed the abolition movements in this country." My response to that is, for far too long, American history has left out a huge contributor to the historical development of our country, the African American voice. Enslaved peoples, enslaved peoples have always had a voice or have always questioned the enslavement that they were put in, far before the American Revolution. For far too long, history has attributed the abolition of slavery solely to white historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln and various white abolitionists throughout our country, with a few black faces sprinkled here and there, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. This has led to a gross miseducation of the American peoples. Before the American Revolution, those who were enslaved questioned the system of slavery. In a country far from home, where the odds were stacked completely against their favor, enslaved Africans across the South fought and dared to believe in a future in which they could stand strong and protect each other. Communities in swamps and mountains and other terrains were developed, even though they knew the consequences for resistance was death. When the rest of our country did not question the horrific system of chattel slavery, these heroes dared to stand up and fight for true American freedom. They dared to look death in the eye, and with their actions declared that they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. This happened far before 1765, and continued to happen until after the abolition of slavery from this country. Yet, young children of all races are not taught of the valor of the African American peoples in this country. Instead, we are taught that African Americans were docile to the oppression, and only when the dominant society decided that slavery was wrong did they begin to fight. Only with the aid of the dominant society did African Americans question their condition. Black children are taught this, and subconsciously, and many times consciously, teachers indoctrinate Black children with inferiority complexes. Today we will speak of heroes of the South and North. Heroes that looked oppression, brutality, and death in the eyes and faced it with their heads held up high. I'd like to introduce Dr. Diouf, professor from Brown University and author of Slavery's Exiles. Thank you, Dr. Diouf, for coming to our city virtually and spreading the education of the Maroons.
A very good afternoon to all from unusually warm New York City. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to thank Mayor Gilman, Olivia Salazar-Debro, and Javon Bird for giving me the opportunity to share the research I did for my book, Slavery's Exiles, the story of the American Maroons. And of course, it's very timely since, as you know, the theme for this year's Black History Month is Black resistance. And resistance has been the basis of all my works over the years. And Marronage was one of the most widespread and successful resistance throughout the Americas. Now let me share my screen with you. I think that, you know, like many people, I knew about Maroons in the Caribbean and Central and South America, but I knew nothing about Maroons in the United States, and I had many questions. But I couldn't find a book about them, so I wrote one. But the first, I think, you know, we have to try to understand what the word maroon means and why where it comes from. So Maroons were enslaved people who fled from bondage and self-exiled to places like swamps and forests and sometimes mountains. And the word cimarron was first used in Spanish colonies. And originally it referred to domestic cattle that had taken to the hills. Cima in Spanish means mountain. But there's another etymology that said that the word would come from the Arawak for something wide. Now, it seemed that the word was used for Africans for the first time in 1522, and that's when people from Senegal staged the first slave revolt in the Americas. It happened in what is today the Dominican Republic, and it was on the plantation of Diego Colon, who was the son of Christopher Columbus. So the survivors joined Native Americans in the mountains, and that's probably, again, the first example of the use of this word for Africans. Cimarron became marron in French, maroon in English. And marronnage existed everywhere there was slavery. And I think that to understand the space, the Maroons of North America occupy, in this country's history and historiography, we need to place marronnage in the context of the entire Western Hemisphere. So there, generally, the colonists' response to marronnage was raids, gruesome torture, executions, and then treaties recognizing the freedom of the Maroon communities and towns, provided that the people did not harbor new Maroons. Now, after they arrived in Panama, Africans were taken to the Pacific coast to board ships that would take them to Ecuador and Peru. And there were several shipwrecks, and the survivors allied themselves and intermarried with indigenous peoples and formed independent communities. In the 1580s, they beat back Spanish military expeditions, and the Maroon leader, Don Francisco de Arobe, here, who was said to be the son of a Senegalese and a native woman, went to Quito with his two sons in 1598 to make peace with Spain. And this portrait was sent to the King of Spain. Now, the African Gaspar Yanga led a revolt in Mexico and founded a large Maroon community. He signed a treaty with Spain in 1618 after a 10-year war, and the community was recognized as independent. Thereafter, the site of this community was named San Lorenzo de los Negros, but in 1932, it was renamed Yanga. So today, a diverse population, as you can see, continues to honor the Maroon leader. Now, here you have a statue of the unknown Maroon in Haiti. And it is located in front of the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince to make clear the Maroon's importance in the country's history. Now, in Colombia, Bencos Bioyo from Guinea-Bissau headed a large Maroon community that signed a peace treaty in the early 1600s, but the authorities betrayed the settlement. And in 1621, Bencos was hanged and quartered. But San Basilio de Palenque, the Maroon community, was officially recognized as free, and it still exists. I took the photo of Bencos in the square of the Palenque, and those are some of the women from the Palenque. Now, starting in Brazil in the early 1600s and lasting about 100 years, the Maroon Mocambo or Quilombo of Palmares regrouped Africans and a number of indigenous people. Estimates vary from 10 to 30,000. people, and they lived in 11 fortified settlements. The last leader of Palmares was Zumbi, and he celebrated in Brazil with Zumbi Day on November 20th, which is the day he was killed and decapitated. His head was displayed on a pike in 1695. So today, the site of Palmares is a national memorial site. Now, Maroon wars took place in Jamaica in the 1700s. And after the Second War in 1796, about 600 Maroons were deported to Canada. And then they were deported again, this time to Sierra Leone in West Africa. But 4 Maroon towns still exist. And Queen Nanny was a celebrated Maroon leader and an expert in guerrilla warfare. And she's honored in Jamaica with a bill, unlike Harriet Tubman in this country. Maroons fought against the Dutch in Suriname, so here. And in 1760, they signed a peace treaty. They were recognized as free people, and they received a yearly tribute. Maroon Day is a national holiday in Suriname. Now, the Garifuna are a mix of shipwrecked Africans and Arawak Carib people. They were originally from St. Vincent in the Caribbean, and the Garifuna community increased with the arrival of Maroons from other islands. In 1773, they signed a peace treaty with the British. But in 1797, the Garifuna were deported to Honduras. Some migrated to Guatemala, to Nicaragua, and Belize from Honduras. And in Belize, Garifuna Day is a national holiday. Today, there are about 200,000 Garifuna in the United States. Now, throughout the Americas, there are well over 1 million Maroon descendants, and many of them speak their own languages, live on the lands carved out by their ancestors, and others live outside of these territories. Now, here's how the Maroons are remembered and commemorated in the United States. They completely disappeared from history. They were ignored even by scholars. And so how do we account for the American Maroons' invisibility? Were they perceived from the start as too insignificant to even be acknowledged? Not really. In 1735, William Byrd, the founder of Richmond, encouraged the exploration of the Blue Ridge Mountains to prevent the Negroes taking refuge there, as they do in the mountains of Jamaica, to the great annoyance of the king's subjects. The following year, he wrote, "We have mountains in Virginia too, to which they may retire as safely and do as much mischief as they do in Jamaica." In 1760, Governor Bull of South Carolina warned that the Blue Ridge Mountains could become a plentiful refuge to the runaway Negroes of this province, who might be more troublesome and more difficult to reduce than the Negroes in the mountains of Jamaica. And in 1763, the well-known South Carolina physician John Milligan Johnson stated, "It can never be our interest to extirpate Native Americans or to force them from their lands. Their ground would soon be taken up by runaway Negroes from our settlements, whose numbers would daily increase and quickly become more formidable enemies than Indians can ever be, as they speak our language and would never be at a loss for intelligence." So to kill any possibility of association between Africans and Native Americans, treaties were signed with Native Americans who agreed to deliver to the British the Maroons who had taken refuge with them. And Native Americans were also used as Maroon hunters. So the potential Maroon threat was taken seriously here. And there was also some apprehension that Maroons could ally themselves with the Spanish or the French, because Maroons in Spanish America had allied themselves with the British, and they were also Maroon pirates coalitions in other places. But more importantly, who were the American Maroons? Where were they? How did they live? Since they live in secret, how do we even find any kind of information about them? So I started digging, and to my surprise, I found a large number of sources that covered most of the South, and these sources were very diverse. There was laws, citizens' petition, trial records of the Maroons, newspapers, articles, official state correspondence, letters, county book, traveler's account, plantation records, jail notices, runaway ads. Maroons also appeared in the memoirs and autobiography of former slaves. And in the 1930s, and about 2,300 formerly enslaved men and women were interviewed, and they provided a wealth of details about the Maroons. However, what immediately became clear is that in this country, Maroons were never called Maroons. They were called outliers or simply runaways. So by not naming them, one could actually deny their existence. And 400 years later, I think it's still working. Very few people know that there were Maroons in this country. But why did people become Maroons? To be free, of course, but besides freedom, people resorted to marronage to avoid the separation of their families. There was no regard for family ties, and anybody at any time could be separated from their loved ones, and they were never told in advance. So the dislocation of families, which was always a reality, became even more dramatic with the domestic slave trade. Between 1790 and 1865, about 1.2 million African Americans were sold down the river. They were sold to the Deep South. Now, if you look at the 1870 census, you will see that a high proportion of people, of Black people in the Deep South, were born in Virginia, in North Carolina, in Maryland. So what happened on the ground? So there were strategies to keep families together, and they were all very risky. For example, the spouse scheduled to stay would follow his or her loved ones down south and settle there at the border of the new plantation. There was another way. Men and women who had been sold down south would walk back to the upper south and stay in the woods near their families. And I think this tells a lot about the bonds of enslaved families. And actually, these strategies were in large part used by men, since mothers were often sold along with their younger children. So being a Maroon was dangerous. They were hunted down by slave patrols, militia, professional slave hunters, and chased by dogs. But Maroons developed anti-dog strategies. They used paper, they used rabbit grease mixed with tobacco, and they put that on their feet or their shoes. They gave poison meat to the dogs, as well as crushed glass baked into a bread. Actually, a Presbyterian minister in Mississippi wrote, and I quote, "They have bludgeons with sharp knife blades deftly inserted in the heavy end of them, and woe to the harm that comes within their reach." Another man said, "When men ran away, if in the day, they returned at night and secured a mowing scythe and took the crooked handle off and put a straight handle on it. Then they made a scabbard of bark and would swing their saber to their side. This was to fight bloodhounds." And if the Negro hunters got too close, many times they were hacked down. So the Maroons took advantage of their environment as secret sanctuary and source of sustenance, but they also played on the negative image of the wilderness as dangerous and savage. And they built a parallel reputation as people who had to be savage and dangerous to be able to live there. Now, the first Maroons were, of course, born in Africa. And actually, a large proportion of the people advertised as runaways were born in Africa. For example, in 18th century Georgia and South Carolina, about 70% of the runaways were African born. And African newcomers were the least cognizant of what it took to survive in the woods, in a new place. But by default, it was the only place where they could find refuge. They could not settle in a city like a lot of runaways did. And amazingly, they often run away weeks and even days after arrival. For example, just 2 days after he disembarked from the hell of a slave ship, Arrow ran away, and he remained a Maroon for at least 3 years. Another man, Biram, had lived enslaved for 8 weeks and 4 years and 4 months as a Maroon. And the lives of African Maroons really illustrate to what extremes they were willing to go to recover their freedom. Records show that they displayed, really a high degree of resourcefulness and organizational skills. And I think that to better understand the reality of marronage, I constructed the model of the Maroon landscape. It was made of 2 areas, the borderlands and the hinterland. So as you can see here, plantation, like here and here, were surrounded by woods, by creeks, by other types of river or streams, and swamps and marshes. And that's where the borderland Maroon settled. It was within walking distance of inhabited areas, and sometimes they even settled on the plantations themselves. So where did they live? So some lived in trees, like this man, when you have a large tree with a large hole. They also lived on trees. One Louisiana man was known to have lived for 3 years in the crown of a large cypress tree. They also lived like here in natural caverns, or they built huts, such as something like that. Solomon Northup, the free New Yorker, was enslaved for 12 years a slave, was enslaved in Louisiana, used to give food to Celeste. She was a young woman who lived, and I quote, in a hut of dead branches covered with palmetto leaves. And she lived there, wrote Northup, for several months. But others chose the most radical form of concealment, and they literally disappeared from the face of the earth. And I was completely astonished when I discovered that, and it had never been mentioned before. Now, in the 1930s, a woman named Cis Shackelford of Virginia said about some people, and I quote, they never would let you follow them. They lived in holes in the ground, so hidden they stayed there for years, and white folks, dogs, or nothing else could find them. And I found examples of cave or dens, as they were called, all over the South. Now, building or excavating a cave really shows creativity and resourcefulness and communal success, because those caves were usually dug at night with the help of people who were still enslaved. And they were excavated near water to throw away the mounds of soil that were carried in quilts. And water, of course, was also essential for the people to drink, to cook, to wash. On average, the caves were 6 feet deep and 8 by 6 wide. They had poles and boards for ceiling. They had plank and dirt to prevent the rain from coming in. And very importantly, they had camouflaged trapdoors. People put leaves, straw, dirt, moss on them. And of course, it had to change according to the seasons. Now, dens were often dug behind a fallen tree so that the branches hid the trap and the trunk served as a walkway that enabled Maroons not to leave footprints around. And those caves were real homes with furniture, with stoves, which had long pipes that carried the smoke away. And actually, people used bark, not wood, because it gives less smoke. One cave, for example, was described as quite a commodious apartment and prepared for an abode of some permanence, being sealed within and stored with fresh and salted pork, several bushels of potatoes and corn, some green peppers, and other articles of sustenance. The apartment was also furnished with some cooking utensils and crockery ware and 2 sleeping bunks. A cave which was found in 1856 near a plantation had a full bed, kitchenware, and abundant food. 3 Maroons had lived there for 6 months, and they had a good amount of pork, flour, cornmeal, sugar, and salt. They even had a large bottle of whiskey. They had guns, powder, and shot. And families with children also stayed in caves, sometimes for years. Now, this photo has nothing to do with Maroons. I'm showing it so that we have an idea of how large a family of 16 people could be. And in Virginia, Patton, his wife, and 15 children, that is actually 17 people, lived in a cave for more than 15 years until emancipation. So they cooked, they washed, and they dried their clothes in the den. The mother and children never got out, but Patton went at night to steal a hog or a cow. Actually, after his failed revolt in 1831, Nat Turner was on the run and he dug a cave. And that's where he was discovered as he got out of it. And you can see, you know, the trunk and the branches of the tree. That cave dwelling really, to me, is an expression of incredible and fierce independence. And it is also as strong a denunciation of slavery as it gets. These are enslaved children. And just try to imagine, even though we actually cannot, what must have been like living in a cave, especially for children who never got out. But parents preferred to have their children live in a cave for years because it was a much better life than being enslaved. So the Maroons at the borderland lived mostly at night. And one of their activities was to procure food. So they hunted, they fished, they gathered, and they also walked to the farms and plantations to get food, information, and be with their families and friends. Now we have a unique testimony from Laura Smalley. She was born in 1861, and she was recorded in 1941. She recounted how people came to the quarters at night to get food and how some of the Maroons looked like.
Well, did the slaves ever try to slip away? They ever try to run off?
No, not on the place where we was. I never hear them say they run off over there. Run off. Other places I hear them stay in the woods and so long until they wear the clothes off them, slip up. Now I heard Mama say when she was a girl, no, she brought from Mississippi. When she was a girl, that one old woman run off. She did run off. The beat her so she run off. And every night she slip home, somebody have her something to eat, and she get that victuals and going back in the woods, stay in the woods. And they, just they tell the other, could you see? I don't know what their name. See so and so. Ever see them? Say no. Well, you tell them if they come home, we ain't gonna whoop them. We ain't gonna whoop them to come home. Well, I'd be all the way though they come. Said once this man stayed in the woods so long, tell you his hair on him long like a dog. Just rolled up, and stayed in the woods. They stayed in the woods. And they couldn't get him out.
So there was a lot of solidarity, and relatives often went to the woods to give food to the Maroons. But Maroons also took whatever they needed from the planters' houses and storehouses and fields and hen houses. For example, 2 men stole half a barrel of sugar, a barrel of salt, a barrel of lard, about 100 bottles of wine, 2 soap dishes, 20 sifters, a large churn to make butter, 2 oxen, and 6 pregnant cows. So this kind of extreme robbery makes plain the kind of heavy damage Maroons could mete out in a single expedition. And there was enough for feeding and quenching the thirst of a good number of Maroons, but it is quite possible that some items were sold or exchanged. Because Maroons were part of an active underground economy that linked them to people still enslaved, to free blacks, sometimes to poor wives, and in some cases, even with slaveholders. They traded honey, fish, shellfish, game, handmade baskets, black moss for guns and ammunition, because Maroons had to be armed to defend themselves and to hunt. Hinterland Maroons were further away from the cities, the farms, and the plantations, and the largest number of Maroons lived in the Great Dismal Swamp, which is between Virginia and North Carolina. So in the hinterlands, people could cultivate and hunt, and they were more self-sufficient. They had houses and canoes made of wood and bark. They dressed, sometimes with raccoon skins. And some people in the Great Dismal Swamps lived there for at least 2 generations. During the Civil War, one officer wrote that he had made families there whose children had never seen a white man. And some Maroons got out with the Union Army, but others never knew about the war and were found after it was over. Osman, an African Muslim living in the Dismal Swamp, was briefly seen by an illustrator in 1856. But generally, hinterland Maroons lived not far away, but the place they chose was isolated. And it is the isolation and the difficulty to navigate the terrain that made it a place of refuge, not the distance from inhabited areas. Because access to the plantation, the farm, and the cities, where Maroons could keep in touch with families and gather food and other necessity, was very important. So hinterland Maroons did not have to stay hidden at all times. They cultivated small fields, they raised hogs and cows, they had houses. So they were less dependent, on the plantation, but they still had to go there for items like clothes, soap, candles, and also for the corn, the rice, before their own fields, he did crops, and also for more meat than they could produce. Now, the most distinctive community in the United States lived in Georgia. It was a large group of more than 100 people, and their settlement was 10 miles from Perrysburg and close to Ebenezer, and about 17 miles from Savannah. It was in this area here. And as you can see, it was an area of intricate creeks and extremely dense vegetation. In October 1786, it was noted with alarm that large gangs of runaway Negroes are allowed to remain quietly within a short distance. So the militia was sent in pursuit of the Maroons. They killed 3 or 4 people, and the Maroon wounded 4 men. So the troop retreated, but came back and made a second attempt. So the Maroons placed sentries in advance of their camp, and the militia fell into the trap. They launched an assault on one of the sentry, and a large party of Maroons descended upon them. So they retreated to their boats. The Maroons tried to cut them off, but they were repelled by cannon, and several were killed. So then the next day, a third party was sent. Now, like a lot of Maroons, the people did not want to put up a fight if they did not have to. Because Maroons were generally outgunned, they used guerrilla tactics. And one of the strategies was to disappear. So when the militia arrived, their settlement was empty. And from Friday morning until Saturday afternoon, the men burned down the houses, 4 acres planted with rice, and a large stock of rice already harvested, and they took away 14 canoes. Now, the Maroons gathered in a swamp in South Carolina, and they continued to go into Georgia. And they said that they took provisions there because theirs had been destroyed. And the reason why they had to be stopped was that the booty they got and the freedom they flaunted were attracting recruits. What happened then is that the Maroons left South Carolina and went back to Georgia to another camp, which was 700 yards by 120 or 17 acres. They erected a 4-foot-high breastwork around the settlement. And there was just a small opening that admitted only 1 person at a time. 2 miles below camp, they had piled large trees across the creek to prevent boats from passing through. And they had placed a sentry. They had built a real war camp, and it's the only one recorded so far in the United States. Now, the settlement consisted of 21 houses that could accommodate up to 200 people. They had planted rice, corn, and potatoes, but they continued to visit plantations to get whatever they still needed. And also, they launched an expedition to rescue their relatives who were still enslaved. Now, after 4 days of intense search, on the night of May 5th, 1787, the militia discovered the sentry and killed him. So then they were able to reach the settlement. And what followed was, again, classic Maroon strategy. Captain Cudjoe, the leader, ordered the women to flee through the canes. The men fired a few shots to slow the militia, and they too ran away. So the invaders killed about 4 or 5 Maroons, and they destroyed the houses, the breastwork, and they took 7 canoes. Now, after he escaped, but then was captured, Louis, the second in command, was tried for murder and robbery. And in the 9-page trial record, we find the testimonies of 2 women and Louis. So quite a bit of information can be found there. In the end, Louis was hung and his head was stuck on a pole. Now, it's interesting that following the destruction of this camp, the usual specter of Jamaica and Suriname resurfaced. An article was published in Georgia and South Carolina, and it stressed that in Jamaica and Suriname, the once contemptible fugitives eventually formed independent colonies and forced Europeans to sign treaties. Likewise, the Maroons of Georgia had been despised and neglected, and their robberies left unpunished, which had led them to have the same aspirations as those in Suriname and Jamaica. Now, what happened when Maroons were caught? They were tortured. In Louisiana, old lady Otter lived in a cave with her 6 children, and she was caught. She was whipped to death, and she was buried in front of the slave quarters. People were also forced to wear this type of heavy iron collar with bells. They had lead leg shackles. They also had their ear nailed to a piece of wood and then cut off. But like this man, some people continue to run away. And some deliberately chose death over slavery. They under torture by their own free will. For example, 3 men had run away from a plantation in Maryland, and they lived in the woods for several months. Then, for some reason, they went back to the plantation. So the planter whipped them mercilessly until he was exhausted. Then he had the first overseer whip them too. And when we talk about whipping, those are the 200, the 300, the 350 lashes. The second overseer refused to obey. The men escaped once more and were chased on horseback, and one of them gave himself up. But the other 2, seeing they were going to be taken, jumped into a furnace. I found another case in Mississippi. An elderly man related a similar case. A Maroon who had been chased on and off for 4 years was finally cornered by dogs. So at last, finding he could not escape, he ran deliberately into a blazing furnace. So the Maroon success was intimately linked to the solidarity of the people who were still enslaved. And their story shows how permeable and protective the community was, with people on any given plantation or farm intermingling with people from other farms and plantations, sometimes far away, and in secret, of course. Also with runaways who were just passing through, and with borderland and interland Maroons. So there was a constant exchange of information, of goods, and support. And despite strict surveillance, people were adept at keeping up the charade, even when the continued relationship with the Maroons was evident. For example, Letty maintained her ignorance of her husband Jesse's whereabouts in the face of obvious clues. The enslaver believed she was still seeing him, and he had been away for several years, but she had given birth to 2 children who looked just like their dad. And actually, they were born in 1859 and 1861 during the 7 years that their father was hiding in the vicinity. And actually, he came back to stay with his family 2 or 3 times a week. William Kennedy's wife was as adamant in her denials. While her husband stayed in the woods for 5 years in the vicinity, she had 2 children who strikingly looked like her other 4. And her enslaver constantly badgered her to reveal Kennedy's whereabouts, but she never said anything. However, some people paid the ultimate price. A Maroon in Mississippi lived in a cave, and the overseer knew he came back regularly to see his wife and get food. And one day he saw him talking to a female relative. The man ran back to the woods, but when the woman refused to give the overseer any information, he beat her to death. Isaac Throckmorton, who escaped to Canada, recounted kind of a similar story. He did not witness it, but he heard the overseer talk about it. A man from the neighborhood had settled in the woods, and it was believed that a woman knew where he was hiding. So when she refused to talk, the man held her over a burning log until she was burned to death. Now, according to formerly enslaved people who lived, into the 1930s and 40s, like this man and women, the Maroons were living well. When you read the slave narratives, they talk about how the Maroons had plenty of food, all the rest they wanted. And there was, of course, a lot of exaggeration because life in the woods was very hard. But, this shows how potent a symbol of freedom and success the Maroons were. And they became folk heroes because of their freedom, but also because they made a mockery of those who hunted them down. And there's a lot of that in the slave narrative, of the 1930s. But also, what they did was also reported by enslavers. For example, Edward Thomas remembered vividly a particular expedition to dislodge the Maroons who lived at the edges of his father's plantation. And I quote, "A well-known man from Savannah with his trail hounds was engaged. I well remember the big 8-oared boat towed to the landing, the buffalo robes and blankets, and champagne, baskets filled with ham and chicken and goodies of all kinds, the demijohn of good whiskey, in case of snake bad, the guns and ammunition, besides a sail to hoist if the weather permitted. Scarcely had the party gotten to the woods about a mile distance when a large party of these runaways came running up from another quarter. And in the happiest mood, bid mother, who happened at the back door, 'Good morning, miss,' and walked toward the well-furnished boat at the landing. They all shook hands with me and, with a big hurrah, pushed off the boats and were gone. I remember father's remark, 'Well, they have the best boat in the county and nothing more can be done now.'" Now, in the United States, the selective narrative of slave resistance is really the Underground Railroad, even though we know that most runaways remained in the South. Another resistance narrative is built around the hero: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner. But the Maroons were mostly anonymous. And there is also, and I think it's crucial, this deep-rooted notion that resistance equals revolts, armed uprising, and anything less is minor and remains under the radar. In addition, when people think of Maroons, they see large communities waging war. And even in South America and the Caribbean, the large communities were the exception, not the rule. So people do not see a woman raising her children in a cave as being a Maroon. So Maroons fall through the cracks of all these extremely reductive narratives that are very far from representing the reality and the diversity of resistance. Maroons have been erased, I think, because they represented self-emancipation, independence, self-determination, and self-rule, which were unacceptable concepts when applied to Black people in general. Because whether in slavery South or the quote-unquote free North, free Black people were segregated, discriminated against, exploited, subjected to humiliation, violence, kidnapping, as well as unlawful enslavement. So the Maroon self-exile was not only a radical denunciation of slavery, but I think that more profoundly, it was a radical rupture that left no place for compromise as they defined and shaped their own freedom and their own world. As we saw, Maroons in the rest of the Americas are celebrated. And I think it's time that those who lived in this country are not only acknowledged, but also honored. To conclude, I will read from the last page of my book. None or few of the men and women whose stories fill these pages cut a dashing figure like Zumbi of Palmares, Alabi of the Saramaca, or Yanga of San Lorenzo de los Negros. There is little to be found here of the flamboyant, seductive heroism of the famous leaders and combatants. But the people who cultivated corn, fished, hunted, and made baskets for trade were as central to the survival of their families, groups, and communities as those who knew how to fight. There is a quiet heroism in the mother who raises young children underground, in the African 2 days of the slave ship who draws upon his self-confidence to measure himself against a foreign environment, in the husband who follows his wife hundreds of miles, in the people who night after night put their life at risk to carry back barrels of corn and a quartered ox to feed their families. Maroons had successes, disappointment, and faced disasters, but in their pursuit of freedom and autonomy, they pioneered and developed unique forms of life as they retreated from, but still measured themselves against a terrorist system and took advantage of a challenging environment. They put their life on the line every day to be free. Their forgotten story is one of courage and resourcefulness, hardships endured, and freedoms won. To a planter who did not understand why he did not return even when he was hungry, at frostbite, and suffered hard times, a Maroon simply replied, "I taste how it is to be free, and I didn't come back." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diouf, for that. That was amazing. I was, completely just enamored. Just listening to, I read the book, but just listening to you lecture about it is just, Slavery's Exile was just phenomenal. I want to say thank you. Even to follow up on when you hear in classrooms, I've heard multiple times in my work in the classroom that African American students asking, and even actually not even just African American students, all students asking, "Hey, well, did they ever revolt, or did anybody fight back, or anything? Was there any fighting back?" And looking at this history, it's a shame that that question should even have to be asked. That it's not taught throughout classrooms across the United States, but even in Washington State. I want to let everybody know on the panel that definitely thank you for all. I see the hearts and the hands and everything like that. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Diouf did a great job. Again, thank you, Dr. Diouf. Olivia has just shared her website, so you can actually go to the website and even purchase the book Slavery's Exiles. It's a phenomenal read. Definitely do this if there's any educators on, which I think there are a few. Definitely, this would be a good book to kind of maybe just read and inform you for next time when you're discussing American history with your students. Next, let's move on to the Q&A. I have one question right here. So everybody who's on, if you have any questions, don't feel don't be afraid to ask them. But I'm going to ask the first question by Brittany Lee. What day is Maroons Day again, please? And how are Maroons and Gullah Geechee connected?
So there's no Maroons Day in the United States. There is a Maroon Day in, for example, in Belize, which is, I think, November 19. November 20. I think I said it in my presentation. There is, so that's in Belize, and there is a Maroons Day. Well, in Belize, it's Garifuna Day, which is kind of the same. And there is a Maroon Day in Suriname, and there is a Zumbi Day, which is also called Black Consciousness Day in Brazil, which is on November 19. So what was the second part of the, there was a second part of the question, no?
Yeah, how are the Maroons and Gullah Geechee connected?
So they are not. The Gullah Geechee are people who lived on the, on the Atlantic coast, a lot of them on the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, but they were not Maroons. They were, they had, they probably retained the most Africanity, if you will. They have their own language, which is made of, I've seen, for example, there is a book on their language, and about 4,000 words, which are from 32 African languages and Arabic, because there were Muslims among them. but they are completely different. You know, there may have been some Maroons among them, but Maroons and Gula are different.
Okay. Thank you for that. Also, thank you. Also, we have a second question from Marianne McNabb. Thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating and highlights a history that is very little known. It should be, so it's a comment. It should definitely be more fully taught and understood. Yes. So yeah, and I definitely agree with that statement as well. Any other questions? You can feel free to type them. Send them in, and I'll definitely read them out. You know, don't feel shy. Okay, great. Jazz Merrill. Thank you. Thinking about the people I want to share this with. All right, Merrill. Thank you for attending. I know we've worked personally with each other in the past. Thank you for that. Yes. Any other questions or, even comments? I know it's a great.
Well, why maybe people are, you know, of questions or comments, I would like to say also one thing which I think is important. I think that people have to understand that contrary to what a lot of people think, all of this is not, and especially young people, it's not ancient history. It's not even the distant past.
Right.
You know, for example, I wrote a book on the people who were on the last slave ship to the United States, the Clotilda, which arrived in Mobile, Alabama in 1860. Now, the last known African who was on this slave ship died in 1940. So, you know, and some Africans deported to Brazil and Cuba were still alive in the 1960s. So they were living at a time when Generation X was coming up, right? Oh. And some people born enslaved in Cuba and Brazil lived until the 1980s. So today, there are even men and women in several countries, including the United States, where the children of men who had been enslaved today. And it's men, because of course men can have children, you know, at very late in their lives. So today in the United States, there are people whose fathers were born enslaved. So again, you know, when you look at it, I think that millennials are the first generation that did not live at the same time as people who were enslaved in the Atlantic world. So I think people have to have this in perspective. Wow. We're not talking about, 1700 or, yeah.
Right. You said millennials were the first generation to be born where there wasn't yet people just enslaved. Wow. Okay, and also Kevin Madison has a question. Are there schools anywhere on this planet where so-called Negro, Black, Colored, African American, etc. children can learn their history, their real names and language, etc.?
Not sure about this question.
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I know that definitely there's probably schools in Africa where they're speaking, indigenous African languages. But yes, and I think this question might be more or less like, how do we get more of this kind of knowledge in the schools? And to that, I'm actually, when we do wrap up, there's a few more questions. I'm going to actually answer some of that too, because that ties into the work that the Hawk Foundation is actually doing. And I'd love for everyone on this panel to actually be a part of that. So, Karensa Mobwa, I'm sorry if I'm getting your name wrong. But when did the last Maroon community end in the U.S.?
Well, there were still Maroons, for example, in the Great Dismal Swamp, and maybe some other places were still in hiding after the Civil War, and including individual Maroons. I give examples in my book of people who got out of the woods after the Civil War, and some didn't even know that there had been a war. So that's after that we don't know. But in the 1860s, maybe 1870s, early, there may still have people living in the woods.
Oh wow. Wow. Also, yeah, thank you, Harenza, for that. I just saw your comment. But let's see. Meryl, also, are there any uses of GIS imaging on these topics? Any data sources you would recommend?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I don't know what GIS is, so here, let me look up what GIS imaging is. But I know one of the data sources for this would definitely be Dr. Diof's book "Slavery's Last Exile." I think that's like one of the best as far as like the
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Boylan Maroons. Yes.
Yeah, because not to blow my own horn, but it's the only book that exists on American Maroons. There's been one of two studies of so-called Maroons in Florida, but their story is completely different. And so the only extensive study of Maroons is really Slavery's Exile, the story of the American Maroons.
And you know what? I don't see it as blowing your own horn. That's the reason we brought you here, because even when I came across your scholarship, I was, my family's actually originally from Virginia, and my last name's Bird too. So I actually ended up going down to the Dismal Swamps after reading your book and doing research and be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. So yeah, I want to say thank you for your contribution to our history. Kevin Madison, Florida is in the news. But in America, anyway, racist bias in education is the norm. We, the progeny of slaves, live among our oppressors. So how can we truly escape and become 21st century Maroons? You want? I would say for locally, like I said, I'm going to give the information for how you can contact the Hawk Foundation, because one of the things, this is actually just the beginning of something larger. We work directly with state and do some legislative work as well, and even just working with the city of Olympia to say, hey, I think within our schools, even if it's local right now, that we should definitely push to have Maroon history taught in schools, because that's a part of American history, and even go to OSPI and provide them resources and even connect them with scholars who have been doing this work so we can continue to grow. So I think that's a part of it, just continuously pushing the work, providing these lectures, working with scholars such as Dr. Diouf, and actually on the grassroots getting the community to advocate for itself and say, hey, this is information that we want for our children to learn. Yes. Perfect. JS Merrill has another comment. GIS software information to satellite derived maps and can be a neat way to present data. Just wondering if that would be useful. So we'll definitely, yeah.
So there's been studies, archaeological study in the Great Dismal Swamp. There is a short book that has been published several years ago on that, and right now I'm working with other people on this community that I mentioned in Georgia, the one I showed, that the one that had the settlement and the breastwork, etc., the largest community. We are trying to actually get funding to explore that place. It's very difficult. I mean, I was there a few months ago. It's, we don't know exactly where it was. We have, there's an idea of the general area, but if we could get archaeological work done there, and if we're lucky enough to find anything, that would be extraordinary. Yeah.
Wow. That sounds phenomenal, Dr. Diouf. I definitely want to definitely keep with that information. Okay, we have another question. Who created the name Maroon for these folks? From Jean Mine.
Yes, so again, it's the etymology is not very clear, but the idea was that it comes from the Spanish cimarron, and cima in Spanish means mountain, and it was used first for cattle, domesticated cattle that had run off and become savage, run off to the mountains, and so that would be the reason why Africans who had been brought to the Americas and run away to the mountains were compared, to these domestic cattle who had become who had gone to the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you. Also, Diana Hansen, were there Native Indians in the countries that mingled with the Maroons?
Yes, and there were actually people, Maroons, who lived in Native American villages. I don't study them because the Maroons that I decided to focus on were the people who lived only by themselves. And my view was that, and in the woods and the swamps, to me, living in an Indian village is not the wilderness. So I was interested in the particular lives of the people who lived in the wilderness, because it's completely different from anything else.
Yes. So any other questions? Any other look for about, give you about 2 minutes. If there's no other questions about that, we'll hit 2-minute frame, then we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Give information again for how you can reach out, go to Purchase Slavery's Exiles and contact the Hawk. So we'll just give it a minute, see if anybody has any last questions or concerns. And thank you, Olivia, for posting the YouTube link for this video. This is phenomenal. So that more residents can get access to just hearing about this information. And I'll say, one new message. Oh yeah, good. Yes, and then Olivia has also posted Dr. Diouf in her research, basically her website. So this is perfect for everybody who wants to just learn more about Dr. Diouf as a scholar, because this was a phenomenal lecture. I think we can wrap up. What I'll do, we have everyone. Thank you for attending. This was phenomenal. The Hawk Foundation is proud to partner with the City of Olympia for making this possible for all of for Olympia's constituency. Thank you again, the City of Olympia. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, Mr. Gilman. Thank you, Olivia. This was again a pleasure. Anyone who has information about just the work after this, I know there's a lot of questions about, okay, how do we strive to make education more equitable in our schools locally? I'm gonna type the information, info@hfeducation.org. Send an email there, and we'll reach out to you, and then we'll let you know what's going how you can get involved in spreading this multicultural initiative throughout our city and our state. And I know Olivia has also posted to sign up for DEI related news at the City of Olympia, and she's giving information for that too. So I want to say thank you to everyone. Are there any last words that from the city that need to be said, or are we free to close it?
No, thank you all so much for being here. We really, really appreciate Dr. Diouf. Thank you for sharing this incredible research. I don't know, I was really just kind of, it was hard to hear some of the pieces, and it was also like I listened to it with so much gratitude that these stories are being uncovered, and how beautiful is it to talk about resistance in this way. And I think that's really important. So thank you so much for for allowing us to hear that. And we really appreciate everything. Thank you, Javon, as always. It is such a pleasure to partner with you to bring these amazing events to the City of Olympia. So we thank everyone for being here. And yes, hopefully we will see some of you at our celebration tomorrow evening with Dr. DeGroy. And then we have a celebration on Saturday at the Olympia Center from 11 to 3. So thank you again for being here.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.